Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I am representing the Office of Strategic Engagement here at JSOU. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have any questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.us as indicated on the slide.
Hey, good morning and welcome to Joint Special Operations University's Think JSOU webinar. I am Dave Oakley, an Associate Professor and Department Chair at JSOU. Today, we are fortunate to host Dr. David Ucko, the Director of National Defense University's College of International Security Affairs Regional Defense Fellowship Program, and the Chair of the War and Conflict Studies Department, to discuss his new book, The Insurgents Dilemma, A Struggle to Prevail. This is David's fifth book, and he has also authored numerous articles on the United Nations, NATO, countering violent extremism, and counterinsurgency strategy. So we're really excited for a nice conversation today, David. Hey, welcome, David. It's great to see you. It's been a while. Congratulations on the publication of your latest book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I thought it was a fantastic read. It really challenges the conventional wisdom and the notion that, all the insurgent has to do is survive to win, while also highlighting some of our failures to really consider the socio-political aspects of insurgencies.
Yeah, well, I think, it was motivated in part by my day job at the College of International Security Affairs, which familiarized me with some insurgent and counterinsurgent settings beyond Afghanistan and Iraq. And I sort of perceived perhaps a consensus among practitioners, academics about what counterinsurgency is and what insurgency looks like that didn't really match the experiences that I was hearing from other places. And so I wanted to write this to be a little bit provocative, a little bit contentious, but hopefully to kind of push the conversation on contemporary insurgency forwards into the 21st century to better anticipate what that's going to look like and to start thinking about what type of response might be needed.
You mentioned the College of International Security Affairs and the program that you run. As in Department of Defense, we're talking about integrated deterrence and the importance of partnerships. You guys really have a unique program there that's probably the most diverse student body-wise of any professional military education that I've seen. Can you comment about a little bit of your program that you run in the student population?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm as you can probably hear from my accent, I'm sort of have a fairly international background. I've always struggled a little bit to think of what constitutes home. But I have to say, where I'm working right now at the College of International Security Affairs within the National Defense University is the most international setting I've ever worked in. Why is this? The program that I'm directing is the Regional Defense Combating Terrorism and Irregular Warfare Fellowship Program, RDFP for short. It's a security cooperation initiative stood up shortly after 9/11 to build partnership capacity, to educate and to train to some degree those countries at the front line of irregular warfare challenges. And so we have classrooms that are predominantly composed of partner nation representatives, and then a smattering of both military and interagency US students to fill out the room. We have basically around 50-50 balance. And what we do is we discuss and we try to anticipate and respond to the challenges of irregular warfare. So that is everything from insurgency to terrorism, organized criminality, but also, it should be said, state-based irregular warfare. Whether we call that hybrid or gray zone, and to think about how security practitioners can map these strategies, be they state or non-state based, to come up with more integrated responses. And maybe that response is deterrence, maybe that response is something a little bit more proactive. That we let the students, the practitioners figure out, but they do stay with us for a whole year. They get a master's degree, they get a JPME2 accredited senior service college degree, and then the return into the field with new skills and new knowledge that they can apply as part of a network to meet common security challenges.
No, that's great. It really kind of highlights the practical application of your book, as bridging that academia practitioner divide, and it's fantastic. To turn to the book now, The Insurgents Dilemma. Rita, I'm very familiar with your previous work. And I saw a message in there that I think has been consistent throughout your writings, that we shouldn't be distracted by the violence per se, but understand the socio-political nature of these fights and why insurgencies have fertile ground to develop. Could you, for the first question, could you tell us what you mean by the Insurgents Dilemma?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, first of all, to pick up on the theme that you rightly discern in most of my writing, it is perhaps, in one way obvious that insurgency and counterinsurgency are primarily political. And yet, despite, decades of saying that, almost repeating it like a mantra, I don't think that we necessarily are responding to insurgency that way. I mean, if you think of counterinsurgency, if you talk about counterinsurgency, most commonly you will be in a military setting. And most commonly, the images that it will evoke will be that of people in uniform and armed going around, engaging in civil outreach or civil affairs of some type. But we don't really talk about these things, and we don't really resource and authorize non-military components of government to engage. And so, yes, I am, trying to beat that drum pretty loudly, and I think this book falls into the same lane. But I think, in a sense, the challenge of bringing in non-military components of response is only going to become more relevant and more intense if the types of adaptations that I speak of in this book come to pass. And so then let me try to respond to your question. What is the Insurgents Dilemma? So the book starts with a puzzle. It takes a line from Kissinger that all the guerrilla army has to do to win is not lose, whereas the conventional army does not win, then it loses. I paraphrase. But that obviously came out of Vietnam and the notion of these things being sort of the graduate form of war, like eating soup with a knife, etc. And in no way do I want to contest the difficulty of countering insurgency. But the point that started becoming increasingly evident to me was that actually there aren't that many cases of insurgents winning or winning by not losing or whatever. I mean, certainly there are many insurgencies around the world. And again, as part of my day job, I engage with officers and officials from Nigeria, Philippines, Peru, Colombia, Niger, what have you, who come with insurgent problems from their homeland, spend a year with me and go back. And we talk about how the response is too militarized, how the government is not succeeding, etc. But in very few cases, I would say exceedingly few cases, do we then hear of that country being overthrown, or where the insurgents have basically taken over the government, as one might have seen quite frequently during the Cold War and even into the 1990s. It just doesn't seem to happen. And so what struck me was that insurgent movements today seem kind of stuck within that sort of harassment phase that Mao Zedong speaks of. They don't really develop the counter state, and they don't go on from there to actually capture the state through a process of gradual mobilization politically and militarily. If we think about, the Cuba example from the Cold War, Vietnam, obviously China 49, and of course China provided really the imprimatur or the blueprint for other insurgency movements around the world. That theory of victory doesn't seem to be particularly promising anymore. And the two cases that really sort of hammered this home to me were really the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, but also ISIS, of course, in Iraq and Syria. I mean, there you have two of the most well-resourced and in some ways sophisticated insurgent movements that we've seen in recent times. And yet, when a concerted response was forthcoming, it took around 3 years effectively to undo their entire counter-state building enterprise. Admittedly, in the case of ISIS, that required an international sort of coalition. But I think it belongs to the story that the underlying problem for the group is I think more common. Once they gave up on their asymmetric advantages, the fluidity, the shapelessness, and the ability to kind of exploit the seams, once they sort of planted their flag and said, this is ours now, they made themselves vulnerable to exactly the type of response that nation states like to use as a sort of trump card against counterinsurgency. The crudest, but also the easiest way of response, which is military strikes, clearing operations, something that most armed forces know how to do fairly well. And of course, we call that mowing the grass because we struggle so much to build on those clearing operations and actually, in a sense, establish a more inclusive political environment that would address the root causes, etc. But one of the things that started striking me is that, in a sense, even though we're just mowing the grass for the insurgents is still mode, and they need to go back again and start over again. And ISIS, I think, illustrates a point. I mean, they're certainly still doing what they do, but they can't proclaim territory without, again, suffering the same fate. And of course, LTTE, and despite sort of the blood-soaked ashes in the Sri Lanka's northeast, we haven't really seen any sign of them coming back. So I started looking at various cases and trying to figure out, when do insurgents actually win? When do they stand up something, claim power, and actually sustain that power in a way that could be spoken of as victory? And there simply are, exceedingly few recent examples of that. The one thing that makes a difference is state sponsorship. And obviously, look at Libya. You just wouldn't have had that outcome had NATO not gone in there to, responsibility to protect or, to overthrow Gaddafi, depending on how you look at it. So state sponsorship is, I think, crucial. It's always been important to insurgent movements. At this point, it's a make or break determinant. So that, to my mind, is Insurgents Dilemma. If I were an insurgent, I would be extremely frustrated looking out at sort of the aggregate experience of my peers and thinking, what can we achieve? How can we, bring this political project to fruition? Where has this worked? Well, it's not working. And so, in my conclusion in the book, I refer back to the film Rambo, and the critical line, do we get to win this time, when he's told that he has to return to Vietnam? Well, I think that question now belongs to the insurgents. When will they get to win? Now, I pause, because of course, I'm sure many of the listeners here will be thinking, well, what about Afghanistan? Yes, absolutely. Perhaps an inopportune time to make this argument, but I hasten to add, I think there are key reasons why Afghanistan happened the way it did. I see it as an exception that confirms the rule. In a sense, that whole experience calls back exactly the Cold War dynamics that allowed insurgents to win back then, but that we don't see it in many other places. And I can go on, we can sort of discuss that more in the Q&A. But that is the insurgents' dilemma. It's a struggle to prevail. It's a struggle to actually bring home the political project that their entire mobilization and their entire violent project is meant to achieve.
Well, speaking about Afghanistan, there was a quote that really kind of captured my attention, and I think it really touches on this aspect that, we focus so much on the violence, we don't understand the root causes or the grievances of the group. But, I'll quote what you said, as that government, while also, and this is speaking about Afghanistan, as that government, while also corrupt and criminalized, was then charged with instilling democracy, a liberal economy, and social justice, it could rightly be said that in this instance, it was the counterinsurgents that were the revolutionaries, seeking as they were to graft a radical project onto an unwilling body. I took from that, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the population and those insurgents were actually trying to pursue. And that, and it was tied to this focus on violence, not really understanding the socio-political context.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's sort of the cherry on the cake. The fact that the political project that we were trying to pursue there was in a sense so wholly incompatible or poorly fitted onto the context that we were working with. But I think, underlying that, there's some sort of more prosaic reasons why Afghanistan is very different from what we see. I mean, some of the key themes that allowed for successful insurgency in the Cold War were, for example, the existence of a vast rural population that could be mobilized, that was very difficult for the state to exert itself in the periphery, or the notion of having a sort of a puppet regime that affects perhaps as a consequence of colonialism, or perhaps the immediate aftermath thereof. And I mean, every country, every state, every government that's threatened by insurgency suffers from some degree of a legitimacy crisis. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an insurgency. But there are few states, I think, that are quite as sort of inauthentic or artificial or hollow as what we had tried to prop up in Kabul, unfortunately. And I think that obviously was brought home quite violently last August. And then the fact that very state was ensnared so deeply in criminality and corruption, which, you could blame the intervening forces to some degree for setting up, bringing in very unsavory characters into the government. But I think you also, of course, have to look at our, political interlocutors for most part of Operation Enduring Freedom. So there are some components here, political, geographic, in the way the state is structured, that is actually very reminiscent of exactly the dynamics for which the Maoist conception of protracted warfare was built. But that does not, you don't see that represented in other states today because of the greater emphasis on urbanization, because of the fact that states are far more established and far more powerful than what we had in Kabul. And because also a greater resistance, I think, globally towards movements of national liberation that were accepted during the Cold War, but simply are not accepted today. The other component here, of course, again, I come back to is state support. I mean, the fact that the Taliban had pretty strong support from Pakistan's military intelligence services makes a huge difference. And it should obviously lead to some interesting thoughts about what's going to happen in Ukraine with regards to insurgency one way or another, given the state's interest in that particular conflict.
I'd like to transition a little bit. Your book focuses on 3 types of insurgencies, the localized, infiltrative, and ideational. Can you provide a quick summary of each of those different types and explain them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the key argument then is that insurgents are no longer winning because when they reach a certain threshold, they make themselves vulnerable to a military backlash. And in that sort of dynamic, the state may not win. We may not achieve our political objectives as sort of a barbarian state where everyone's happy and everyone's included and accommodated, the armed reform of counterinsurgency, but the state survives. And it keeps the insurgent project under that particular threshold. And so what then will insurgents do? It's my contention that they will adapt. We see warfare as a competition of wills. And so what kind of adaptation can we see? So my book explores 3 particular routes or new theories of victory, if you will, that insurgent movements could, and I think to some degree already are using. And then it comments on how states might need to counter or respond to those innovations. And so the first one, as you say, is what I term then a localized approach to insurgency. And what I mean by this is that traditionally insurgent movements would be pitted against the state in a zero-sum competition for the government, the seat of power, the capital city. And that's, I think, where they run into trouble, because that requires then an increasingly hostile and aggressive and confrontational stance, which prompts then the government to use every resource at its disposal, but predominantly the use of armed force to tamp that down and to control and suppress that. So the response then by many insurgent movements is not to aim for the capture of the capital city, but rather to localize the struggle in those parts of the nation state where the government anyway is perhaps not so present or perhaps so interested. And I look at this in 2 different ways. One responds to the fact that around 54% of the world's population is currently living in urban settings. And so you have these sprawling, growing metropolises where the state is struggling to really assert itself. And you can look, for example, at Rio and the favelas, but you could also think about Mexico City or the San Pedro Sula of Honduras. Many examples from South America, unfortunately, where in a sense you have pseudo-sovereign entities at the local level where criminal insurgents are doing what they need to do, making vast profit, and basically have turned these areas into no-go places for the state. The gangs then decide who lives and dies. They are the ones who set the rules, and they are in effect governing, albeit for profit, but still representing a very political challenge. And they're in a sense winning by their own metrics. And you could actually, in my book, I talk about one example, a sort of a prototypical example of this also from Iraq, with what Muqtada al-Sadr did in Sadr City, basically turning that slum into his source of people power, turning it into sort of a no-go area for the state, and using that leverage then to affect politics and to pursue his own political project. So that is sort of a localization, and I think it's made more powerful by the fact that whereas in the Cold War you really needed the capital to sort of achieve your political objectives, today we are far more transnationally linked, whether it's through commerce or social media or whatever, that controlling the capital is no longer really that necessary. And this approach works, again, because the state may not care. Elite apathy effectively allows for that sort of abandonment and exploitation of lost territory. I should add that, even though urbanization obviously is a strong driving factor of this, it doesn't mean that rural localized insurgent struggles won't appear. In fact, I see them also as more likely, particularly as states focus on what they think is most important, that is to say their cities, and let go of those peripheral areas where they don't really have any interests. And so to take, for example, the northern Mali, is called informally Mali inutile, that is to say it doesn't have any purpose. So the elite in Bamako never really has an interest in asserting statehood and including this as part of some grand nation building endeavor. That's just not going to happen. But similarly, I don't think the groups in northern Mali will be particularly interested in marching south and taking over the whole country themselves. And so you have these states that are effectively fragmented. It's sort of a shared sovereignty. And the group and the state come to some sort of, implicit understanding. And states can celebrate that they are not being overthrown. The groups can pursue their localized project. And in a sense, that is how it works. And the implications of that can be stable to some degree, but they're also extremely vulnerable to disruption. And then the second theory of victory that I pursue then is infiltration. So that rather than putting out assets that can be struck militarily, the group, in fact, tries to work through the existing government to infiltrate it. And I use the image of a Trojan horse, so as to, in a sense, corrupt the government from the inside. By presenting itself as a political party or as a social movement organization, it becomes very difficult for the state to use its favored coercive response, because doing so will be far more flagrant and far more objectionable to sort of contested audiences. What makes us different, however, from traditional party politics, which is, I guess, what we should be aiming for in these contests, is that the group still uses violence and terror and intimidation, but it does so on a sort of an unaccountable, randomized basis. And so it uses that to clear obstacles, but it never owns up to its actual ownership of that particular line of effort. And so in the book, I look predominantly at two key contemporary examples, one being Bolivia and the other one being Nepal. And just to dwell a little bit on the Bolivia example, you see here a cocalero organization invested in the sort of trafficking and growth of cocaine, creating a political party using social movement mobilization to effectively gain power, gain democratic power. But on the side, all the time, also using violence to create incidents, to harass the state, to clear obstacles in the way of political progress, and also, of course, to disrupt the counter-narcotics operations of the government. And so some scholars have called this sort of a modern neo-Leninist insurgency, in the sense that Lenin too advocated for the creation of a political party as a vanguard of the struggle. The difference is the sort of the duplicitous nature, where you pose as an innocent movement, all while you still retain a clandestine armed component. You can also think a little bit about Sinn Féin and its relationship to the IRA during the Troubles as an example of this. And in Nepal, I don't want to go on it too long, but effectively what they did in 2005, 2006 was to eschew a violent political struggle very much familiar to us from the Cold War, and actually embrace peace and democracy and everything, all while using paramilitary outfits to get rid of critics, to impose their own views, to silence journalists, etc. And it's violence of a very sort of low intensity, but still very effective, much like sort of mob violence. Those who need to know, get to know. And it's something that, in a sense, allowed Nepal to enter the democratic process and do fairly well, holding the prime ministership and so on, and having a sort of a slice of power. So Tom Marks, who is a colleague of mine at the College of International Security Affairs, has called this the unrecognized second coming of people's war. And I think that's quite apt. And then the third approach that I look at is called ideational insurgency. And this kind of ties in a little bit to the theories of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian sort of Marxist, when he talks about culture producing politics. And so what I'm talking about here is the fact that what you can do with social media and virtual networks is effectively take your forces away from the tangible realm where they can be easily targeted into a virtual domain where you can achieve the same effects, whether it's mobilization, recruitment, indoctrination, and the execution of violence. And it gives the state very few targets to strike. Some people call the ensuing terrorism stochastic, in the sense that it is random in its incidence, but still predictable in its occurrence. That's to say, we know it's going to happen, we just don't know when it's going to happen. And of course, trying to preempt that, never mind soaking up its polarizing logic, is extremely difficult. You can look at what ISIS is trying to do with its virtual caliphate as one key example, and I explore that in the book. But in fact, I think the more relevant prototypical case here is whether we call it the alt-right or let's try that again, right-wing violent extremism. The 6th January attack on the Capitol grew out of what I see as an ideational insurgent movement that pushes norms, that mainstreams very violent extremist ideas and mobilizes people through a sense of virtual belonging to take on the mainstream and attack the real world, which of course is an interesting concept to dwell on in its own right. So those are sort of the three theories of victory. And of course they could be combined or whatever, but I think what they all share is that they're so exceptionally adaptive. What they do is they take the military trump card that militaries around the world have relied on, for better and for worse, which is the use of military response. It takes that trump card off the table because there are no military targets to strike. And instead, what it does is it attacks the state on social, economic, political, and informational fronts with violence calibrated to clear obstacles along the way, forcing, therefore, a response that also has to be politically and economically and socially invested. What do we mean by democracy? Which parties get to participate? How do we combat disinformation online? How do we control what social media companies should host and should not host by way of content? And in terms of localization, how do we bridge societies? How do we, in fact, give credence to the notion of a nation state when the median state out there is grossly fractured and in a sense, maybe was never actually a nation state to begin with in a sort of concrete way. So lots of big sort of philosophical, political questions to dwell on. And in a sense, therefore, all the more important to broaden the discussion of contemporary insurgency beyond the military and to speak about it also in other fora. So that's a very brief synopsis, and I know that I covered a lot of grounds, but I wanted to make sure that I provided you some insight into those three different approaches that I cover.
No, thanks, Dave. That's great. We're starting to get a lot of questions from the audience, and the first one really touches on something that you said earlier about insurgency as part of a broader strategy during the Cold War. And so Ken Glyman asks, we often think about state sponsorship of insurgents as activity of authoritarian regimes, but Western democracies are no strangers to the provision of state support. What are the challenges to democratic regimes in providing support to insurgents? Is this an area of IW that can be useful in this era of strategic competition and integrated deterrence?
Yeah, no, I think it will be for sure. And I think, perhaps Ukraine will be the first test case of this. We've spoken a lot in the last few years as strategic competition has become more mainstream about the salience of unconventional warfare experiences. But I think the question is absolutely right. There are certain ethical challenges that the West will find itself with in terms of the frequent use of insurgents of terrorism. And the notion of finding insurgents out there that we can sponsor and somehow control to avoid their use of terrorism and the targeting of civilians for political effect, I think is just not going to work. And so we then have to sort of make a difficult decision as to what we're actually fighting for. If we want to claim that we stand for something better and that justifies our stake in the strategic competition, that is the world we're fighting for, well, then we best ensure we don't lose those very values in the way that we choose to prosecute that struggle. Now, there are other alternatives out there. And you may recall during the 1990s, there was a movement that sought to build capacity and capability among non-violent movements, the notion being that that would be more effective as a way of toppling dictators, etc. Now, maybe I've been working in the DoD for too long, but I foresee mass slaughter on the horizon if we sort of unquestioningly embrace that just because it sounds nicer. But perhaps, you know, we need to also explore, again, given the changes in insurgency, how we can approach this in a less military way and actually mobilize a people to support. Arguably, I think people power, in a sense, is strategically decisive, maybe not in the near term, but certainly as time progresses.
Continuing with kind of the regime type and the difference in counterinsurgency approaches, or what creates fertile ground for insurgencies. Lori Reifstack asked, you know, in your research, did you find a correlation between increased global communication or pockets of restricted communication to the effectiveness of insurgencies? Are insurgencies more or less effective in regions or states where public access information is controlled or limited by the state?
I mean, I think so. I think you look at Xinjiang and it's a case in point, or even Tibet for that matter. I mean, where the state is able to introduce sort of a police rule or police state mechanisms, it becomes very difficult, one, to mobilize, and two, to export that message onto the global stage. Even then, of course, you know, those who want to know get to know, but it's easy for these things just to fall off our radar. And as authoritarian governments in particular clamp down on the use of the internet, for example, or adopt the sort of, you know, artificial intelligence or big data types of tracking and surveilling and censoring their population, that's going to be a real challenge, absolutely. I would also say that there's another component to this, the global communications aspect that you mentioned. If you think of, for example, ISWAP in the northeast Nigeria, what do they actually want to achieve? I mean, we say they want to build a caliphate, etc. But I mean, is that actually a realistic end state? Or is their struggle more expressive? It's about using social media, you know, showing their power, showing their sort of tactical victories over the Nigerian armed forces. But in effect, it's an informational struggle in the sense that they want to build up their brand name more than actually govern and rule, as we might have thought insurgency should do in the Cold War, etc. And so it is then becoming a sort of a competition of narratives. And where that is the case, again, we have to be very careful that we don't play into that narrative by mistaking their endpoints, their end state and objectives. The other component here, of course, I mean, I've researched and written on authoritarian counterinsurgency in the past. And while there's a little bit, I've discerned a little bit of envy almost in sort of US, UK, or sort of Western liberal context about what the authoritarian states can do. You know, what are we actually fighting for? You know, if we say that authoritarian counterinsurgency or clamping down on information is effective, what is it effective at? And, you know, we do have to remind ourselves of the reasons why we're fighting. Is it sort of regime security in a very narrow sense? Or is there a broader component of armed reform or armed politics that should govern the way we choose our strategies as well?
And to me, you really put that kind of highlight on, you know, what is security itself? You know, is it from the security of the state, or is it also looking through the viewpoint of the individual, and security of the individual? You know, at JSOU, we talk a lot about the concept of compound security environment. So where you have these multiple issues, you know, you have the great power competition, you have climate change, you have terrorism, all coming together to create, you know, these compound problems that we have to face. One of the questions that came in looked at the climate and climate change, the climate crisis, and the participant was wondering if we might expect insurgency groups to intentionally take advantage of and leverage incidents where climate impacts are eroding the ability of a weakened state to uphold its social contract to protect its people.
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think that seems fairly likely. I mean, as states become ever more fragile and more fragmented and looser capacity, rivals are going to make a claim for power. So I see that as very likely. And already now, there's organized criminal groups out there who are, hoarding water supplies because it's becoming such a strategically critical resource. But I think the other component of the climate change, which I think is worth anticipating, is that it will increase the process of urbanization even further. I mean, the rate of growth of these cities, particularly in the developing world, is absolutely staggering. And these are cities that are growing in absolutely unsustainable ways as it is. Slum populations accounting for around 43% of your average developing world city. And so there you see again a very large likelihood, a very significant likelihood of fragmentation, of sort of micro sovereign entities coexisting with the state. And we start then wondering, or we have to wonder, what is a nation state? I mean, we base our entire international society on norms and expectations is predicated on a notion of cohesive nation states and governments able and willing and interested in governing their people. It seems to me that that lens is not particularly helpful, and we have to get far more creative. And this is something that I dwell on in my comments on how to respond to localized insurgency, for example, being far more creative about how we actually want to put states together in a way that's at all politically relevant or at all politically viable. And obviously that's a question that would have been very relevant to our conversations about Afghanistan. What would have been the ideal structure of that state? We went in with a bond process and we never really looked back. But to my point, it's emblematic of a lack of creativity and political imagination as to what states in so many parts of the world actually look like. So yeah, I think the climate crisis and the displacement and the insecurity and vulnerability and the limited state capacity is going to just reinforce all of those trends.
In your book, and you touched on many of them, you have numerous case studies, for the three examples. Do you see within the case studies that you've looked at or others where insurgent groups are learning from each other and adapting? I mean, is there kind of a, sharing of the best going on?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I've seen direct evidence of it. And in a sense, you could maybe claim that I'm doing a little bit of that thinking for them by piecing together tendencies or theories of victory that are currently distributed worldwide. I mean, in my chapters on infiltrative insurgency, for example, I mean, I go back to the United Front theories of Lenin and Trotsky and relate that to how the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, won power in the 1920s in Weimar Germany through a sort of strategy of infiltration, where violence played a role, but it was deliberately calibrated to be below a certain threshold. And then I sort of look at how Northern Ireland informs this. So the sort of work of tying these different things together, perhaps I haven't seen so much evidence of that that happening among insurgent strategic theorists. One thing they are quickly learning from each other, however, is that trying to force this climactic confrontation with the state just illustrates, and I air quote one sort of Islamist strategist, your willingness for martyrdom. I mean, that you will be slaughtered, you will lose that battle, and it may look good, in terms of headlines for a few days, but where would you stand afterwards? And so, for example, ISIS now is talking about continuing to harass and continuing to make a name for itself, and maybe forming what they call semi-conventional units. But what is that? What is a semi-conventional unit, and how does that actually contribute to their political end state, to their theory of victory, or the notion of holding territory or creating a caliphate? So I think that there's a realization among many insurgent groups that the climactic battles and the sort of we're here to stay, that kind of posturing is not going to work. And so the adaptation that I speak of in my book, I think will become more prevalent. That's my prediction. I mean, it's sort of an exercise in forecasting, albeit based in historical precedent.
I'd like to circle back a little bit with kind of the future of insurgencies, or insurgencies as a broader within a broader strategy as we look at great power competition, integrated deterrence. I know in your book you're very specific. Like you weren't really making a moral judgment call. You were assessing objectively insurgencies, while at the same time encouraging counterinsurgency strategies that don't just focus on violence, but really understand the socio-political conditions and the grievances that's driving that violence. With that in mind, and thinking of the democratic principles that we have, how do you balance the use from a democracy of feeding into insurgencies, shaping the narrative of foreign population, while also having these democratic principles and the concept of state sovereignty and stuff like that? Because you're really, at the end of the day, trying to influence and I hate to use the word, manipulate populations to a degree. And so your thoughts on how do you balance between the need to do that and then some of our principles?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it ties into particularly the chapters on the ideational insurgency piece. And if I may just, something struck me about the previous question, that interestingly, you do see a sort of a theoretical nexus, if you will, between what we might call the alt-right and what ISIS has attempted. And I can't remember which institution it is now, but somewhere out of London, they've done a very good job showing how the mimetic approaches of both of these networks are actually converging and using very similar methods. So again, I don't know whether anyone's actually gone out as theoretician and sort of learned from, but I think clearly there is some cross-fertilization of ideas even across fairly broad ideological chasms. But to speak to how to respond to that without sort of losing our soul, it is a real challenge. And I come back to it again and again, because it seems like the type of response, philosophy, mindset, and care are most needed where the problems are least likely to manifest themselves. And so, to take one example, you speak about manipulating effectively your own population. You think about the preventing violent extremism or countering violent extremism frame. So this is an attempt then by the state via various civil society interlocutors to sort of change people's minds. Don't embrace that violent ideology. Think about the good life and the state and society, etc. But of course, there's only a thin line between telling someone not to blow themselves up or to reconsider and to engage in peaceful contestation, which we might want to see, and basically policing their thoughts and saying that if you're a Muslim in Xinjiang and if you have tendencies against the state, it's because you're going off on a wrong trajectory, when that is exactly the appropriate response to what the Chinese authorities have put in place there. And of course, the Chinese government will claim that they're doing preventing violent extremism in their massive sort of camps of re-education for the Muslim population there. And we can convene with them and have a conference on PVE, which obviously speaks to completely different realities. And similarly, I mean, Germany and some other states in Europe after the Second World War put in place in their constitution a ban on certain parties competing democratically. So a Nazi party cannot exist in Germany, or in some of the former Soviet states, a communist party cannot exist, because they are so concerned about their own history and the repeat thereof. And that might be perfectly appropriate. But we also know that in the wrong hands, that exact tool, what's called militant democracy, could be used to form effectively a one-party state. And so all the weapons at our disposal, all the things that states can do, have a sort of a dark underbelly of abuse. And gauging between use and abuse is extremely difficult. And what you just have to hope for, of course, is that you have an independent judiciary, you have an outspoken civil society, etc. But again, those things seem to apply most in those cases where the problems are less likely to manifest themselves. And so, in a sense, there's putting a lot of emphasis on hope. So yeah, it is a problem that I come back to again and again. It's also a problem, I think, that comes back to our discussion on strategic competition. That is to say, how do we compete with the likes of Russia without, in a sense, becoming like Russia? And I am a strong believer in reinforcing what we stand for in our response, because I think ultimately that is the winning argument, rather than, you know, having a race to the bottom.
So, you know, shifting a little bit, I know your book isn't really focused, you know, it's on Ukraine, or, you know, it's what's going on in Ukraine, but it, you know, there is some relevance for it. And so the next question is, you know, we have seen political institutionalization efforts from the Russian regime started at the same time within the theater of operations, Ukraine. You know, the example they provided was a substitution of force by an elected mayor of Ukraine. Can you elaborate on the consequences of such non-legitimacy actions regarding the ability of allies' jurisdiction to intervene, to do something about what Russia is doing in that regard?
Yeah, so let me say this, that even though, I mean, the book that obviously was written before this crisis, this war unfolded in this particular episode. However, every strategy that I explore in the book are used by revisionist states to foment instability, to erode legitimacy in their region or further afield. And so the notion of localization, for example, I mean, it's quite clear that Russia has sponsored localized insurgency movements, if you will, in eastern Ukraine, in Georgia, and so on, to effectively split those societies, to create realities on the ground, and in effect create divisions, nation-state divisions that the international community had to sort of begrudgingly accept. I mean, you know, this is what it is. And the notion, it operates by very similar logic to the other cases that I see. The notion of infiltration. I mean, you can see quite clearly how Iran sponsors political parties across the Middle East, and not least Iraq, which have an armed militia on the side able to use violence to clear obstacles. And you see then the sort of the corruption and subversion of democratic norms, and the rendering of that line between licit and illicit basically meaningless. And in terms of ideational, again, Russia sponsoring far-right movements, and sort of, again, effectively the attempt to hack the election, etc., using the internet, sponsoring online communities, and creating the very ideologies that then spawn violence within the targeted societies. So these types of strategies are part and parcel of what we may want to call unrestricted warfare, or, you know, some may have called the Gerasimov doctrine, which I know is unfortunately named and not a doctrine, etc. But the logic still applies. The notion of staying below a particular threshold, creating social and economic and political realities, using violence only insofar as necessary, but not so much to launch a backlash. I mean, this is, I think, a state and a non-state area of investment. And I mean, what's surprising, I think, about the current war is just that this wily and very tricky character, strategist, Putin, has acted in such a stark and absolutely unambiguous way, and effectively marshaled an entire global world opinion against him. I mean, you know, that is quite surprising, and one that therefore wonders what went into him. So yeah.
You know, so we're getting a lot of questions on the domestic aspect of the book, and your look at some of the right-wing extremism, and questions that came up about, you know, how about left-wing extremism. First, I'll give kind of my take, and then let me know if this is accurate from my read of your book. But it seems to me that one of the reasons you focus on right wing was the scale and scope. Not denying that there's not any left wing kind of movements, but not to the degree where we have seen ideational kind of go into infiltrative that we've seen within the right wing the last 5 years. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, it wasn't long ago that the US had a major problem with left-wing terrorism in the 70s, or the Weather Underground, or what have you. But I think anyone looking at current trends, I mean, there's an undeniable difference in scale. And so right now, you have polls suggesting disturbingly alarming acceptance of extremely right-wing and intolerant views among mainstream society. And that, to my mind, is a product of exactly the ideational insurgency that I speak of. It gets to the most extreme into, conspiracy theories, unfortunately, and the notion that the state is effectively a tyrant that needs to be overthrown. And obviously 6th January plays into this, but similarly, so did Charlottesville. So I just don't see anything comparable in scale on the left-wing side, but that is not to say that this form of insurgency is in any way restricted to right-wing ideologies. It just so happens that that's the most pronounced expression of it in this time.
Being working at a professional military education institution, JSOU, being a PME institution, our main focus is really on educating the practitioner to be more thoughtful, therefore more effective. I'd like you to comment a little bit on, the importance of education for the practitioner. To me, it seems like it goes directly to, in order to understand the effectiveness of the military weapon, those who employ it must also appreciate the social political dynamics involved in where they're employing it. So I'd like for you to comment a little bit on it from your experience and how it influenced the writing of this book.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it did, and it does. I do think that ideally, when we confront problems of political violence, those responsible for response need to view the violence within that political context. I mean, that to my mind is the ideal starting point. But to be a little bit contentious, it strikes me that, if states are surviving, even though their response seems politically void of content, then where's the incentive for them to, develop the sort of the 21st century warrior scholars who can read the environment and informational, etc. I mean, to take the example of Nigeria, right? And so it has experienced ethno-religious violence in the Northeast for decades. And then, Boko Haram, as it's commonly known, turned up and the violence is absolutely devastating. I mean, it's actually, even at the height of ISIS, causing comparable or even higher level of deaths. And then, ISWAP as a splinter movement has now taken over. And you think, well, what are we going to do? This is outrageous. And the socioeconomic levels there in the Northeast are nightmarish. I mean, you may have heard of the so-called sort of Al-Majiri problem, which basically speaks to millions of kids running around, basically taking care of themselves and obviously being extremely vulnerable to recruitment and who are enrolled in sort of, basically Islamist boarding schools of no real credible standing or whatever. So it's a very explosive situation. And of course, it's a transnational problem as well. But what must the government do? Well, that question really gets at some difficult political truths, because the government, whether it's done so deliberately or unwittingly, has reasoned that this can be contained. I mean, in the response that we see, there's not the level of attention and care about this problem as one might have thought. And so why is that? Is it possible to actually sustain a political economy for the elite or for those people who are sort of, within the state, and to leave behind or just to manage those who are deemed, in peripheral areas, whether it's geographically or politically? It seems like many states are reasoning one way or another that they can do that. Because if you think about across the Sahel, if you think about even in Colombia, a counterinsurgency success case, the hinterland where around 4% of the population lives is also where we see the most political violence. But there's a real schism between that and the West, where you have the main cities and you have the international linkages, and you have so we have to, in a sense, be realistic. We're not going to be able to impose a sort of an enlightened state-based counterinsurgency and a sort of a process of national repair and recovery without convincing those who are responsible for strategic decision-making that that is in their interest. And I don't think that they see it as worthwhile. I don't think we've made the case very effectively. And so then you get into conversations like, and this has been referenced in the literature, as, hybrid political orders or mediated states, and the notion of a different sort of social and political compact. What level of devolution, what level of fragmentation can we tolerate or can we accept in society or in a nation state without, in a sense, losing the coherence of the entire system? And so, again, this calls for a far more sophisticated underpinning, theoretically, of the type of orders that we are going out to defend. Do we want to reconstitute these countries as nation states when perhaps in some respects they were never nation states? And if not that, then what? What is the political objective? And so in a roundabout way, yes, I do agree with you that of course we have to see the violence within the social and economic political context, but I think we also have to understand and appreciate that it ain't gonna happen. I mean, it is not happening now. And so we have to get far more creative about how we can change and channel the calculations of interest that underpin various counterinsurgency efforts around the world.
No, thanks. It sounds like you're actually on the latter part, the possibility of even having change, whether or not the policies we're trying to achieve through counterinsurgency strategies are even achievable, and at what cost are they achievable?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we are in a sense fighting the last war in our understanding of counterinsurgency. And that's fine, so long as our adversaries are also fighting the last war. So long as they insist upon coming to us armed and ready for a fight, well, that, we will basically see the same cycle repeat itself. This is the Insurgents Dilemma. On the other hand, given what we know about warfare as a strategy, as a competition of strategic wills, political wills, and what David Kilcullen writes about in terms of the adaptiveness and the sort of the co-evolutionary notions or norms of what happens when two adversaries meet, I think it is just a matter of time before our insurgent adversaries are going to try to break that cycle and come at us with a far more innovative and disruptive theory of victory. And that's kind of the purpose of the book, that I wanted to start a conversation about counterinsurgency away from the military field. What does it mean to actually manage social and political change that is lubricated by violence, but not defined by it? That is driven by political, social, economic forces, and yet enabled perhaps by a very calibrated use of terrorism and subversion. What do we do then? Because then we have to get far better at our own social and economic and political policies. And I think that's been a minimal area of investment in the types of counterinsurgency struggles that I see unfolding across the globe.
Well, it seems to me you really raised two questions. What should be, or would you recommend as the future of counterinsurgency approaches, versus what do you think will be the future of counterinsurgency approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not exactly optimistic, to be honest. I mean, I think so long as states can get away with doing the bare minimum, particularly when it's in peripheral parts of the country, then that's what they're going to do. Right? And endless amount of security assistance, security cooperation, etc., is not going to change those entrenched interests. And so then we either have to get very realistic about the costs and benefits of such a minimalistic approach, or we have to figure out ways of changing those calculations of interest to begin with. And what are the costs and benefits of doing that? The real challenge, however, as I alluded to, is when the strategy changes. David Spencer is a colleague at the Perry Center, also hosted at the National Defense University. And when he talks about the rise of power of Evo Morales in Bolivia, he says that it was such a successful insurgent strategy that it wasn't even recognized as such. And I think therein lies the puzzle, therein lies the danger. When we have, for example, anti-democratic parties using violence as part of their strategy to catapult themselves into positions of power that then cannot be contested because they're seen as legitimate, well then, how does one undo that? That, to my mind, is a real philosophical challenge. And of course, it's not just Bolivia. I mean, we see this in other contexts as well. So yes, we have some serious thinking ahead of us, I think. And it'll be even more important, I think, for these conversations to occur, not just in military contexts such as ours, but further afield in those institutions of politics, society, and really what, in a sense, what we're fighting for ultimately.
No, I agree with you. You know, in my mind, it takes this ongoing conversation. You know, we call it integrated education, where you know, and I think you guys do this a lot at CISA. You bring in folks from diverse backgrounds, from partners, from allies, from an interagency, and you have a conversation. I think that portion of education allows you to kind of have a common appreciation, maybe not agreement, but a common appreciation of the environment, and to have these discussions that lead to understanding that's necessary before you take action. And so, you know, with that, we're at the top of the hour. I'd like to give you a few minutes to give any kind of parting thoughts before we transition out.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say that there is an element of commonality, again, between the different problem sets that I've tried to investigate in this book. And they speak really to this contestation of narratives of what the state stands for, what is a society actually for. It gets to the very heart of how we organize politically and collectively. And I would, again, like I know that it sounds appealing as an injunction, but I think it actually has also strategic consequence, which is to think very long and hard about what is the meaning of a state, what is the purpose of a state, and what is the purpose of a society. What do we mean by national security? Who is it security for, and for what purpose? And I think there's been a level of complacence in the way that we've approached political violence, perhaps in the West, but I would say even further afield, about sustaining the status quo. That status quo ante is sort of what we're aiming towards. With the types of fractures, with the types of contestation currently ongoing and likely to be seen, and again, the book tries to explore some of the prevailing strategies that I would expect to see, the kind of conversations that I'm talking about really need to be taken more seriously. I think we need to move beyond the sort of rhetorical invocation of a comprehensive approach or strategic thinking or political literacy, etc., even though, of course, that's exactly the argument I'm making now, and really, you know, have a serious societal conversation about what it is that we want to fight for. What is, for example, what is the type of social media environment that we want to have? I mean, authoritarians have an answer to this. They will just clamp it down. But what's the balance between inciting terrorism, for example, and freedom of speech? Or what are the red lines that a democracy can accept in terms of, frankly, anti-democratic parties competing in a system, perhaps only to overthrow it? You know, we need to have those types of conversations. And I don't think that we are. And so before we take the whole insurgency, counterinsurgency thing and kind of throw it into the trash, because we're now in an era of strategic competition, let's remind ourselves of these questions, because I think they affect great power competition as much as they do competition against internal threats and adversaries.
No, thank you, David. We appreciate your time today. You know, I highly recommend the book. I thought it was a fantastic read, highlighting, you know, many issues. I think, as you point out, it's just not about insurgency, counterinsurgency, but great power competition and how we think about security, you know, as a nation. So very important. For all the listeners, the watchers, there is a code to purchase the book, 30% off. I believe it's going to be available in the States in June, but you can pre-order that either using the 30% code or on Amazon. I saw that was available there today. But thank you, David, for your time. I look forward to future conversations on this topic and hearing more about your book.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks to those attending. It's obviously a topic close to my heart. If you do get a chance to read the book, or if you have comments on anything I've said, please get in touch. Always happy to continue the conversation.
And for all the Think JSOU listeners, thank you for joining in. Hope you can join us next time.